Welcome to the fifth lecture in this short series on Hitler's road to war. In this section, we will study why was Hitler able to conquer Czechoslovakia in 1938. We will begin by examining the Sudeten crisis, which allowed Hitler to gain a region of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. We will then examine how Hitler was able to fool the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who was following a policy of appeasement. Finally, we will examine how Hitler was able to conquer the whole of Czechoslovakia, and the consequences this had for the road to war. Let's begin by examining a map of Central Europe. Here we can see how Anschluss, the unification of Austria and Germany, has resulted in Czechoslovakia being surrounded on three sides by the Nazi Third Reich. Czechoslovakia had been created as a new nation as part of the Paris Peace Conference, and so Hitler targeted it as part of his aim to destroy the Treaty of Versailles, especially since some territory had been taken from Germany to create this new nation. This highlighted region, shaped like a horseshoe, is a region called the Sudetenland. The region's area acts almost like a buffer zone between Nazi Germany and the rest of Czechoslovakia. Hitler set his sights on this region first since there was a large German-speaking population who wished to join the Third Reich. Hitler always intended to take the Sudetenland first, then take the rest of Czechoslovakia. This is because Czechoslovakia was quite a rich country with a well-developed rail network, fortifications and rich mineral resources, and a strong army. This would meet his aims of rearmament, as he would grow his army and gain more raw materials. Furthermore, he would be achieving Lebensraum, living space for the German population, alongside consolidating the Third Reich's central position in Europe. The Sudetenland was home to approximately 3 million German-speaking people. Hitler claimed that these residents were being persecuted because they considered themselves ethically German and not Czech. This fed into his foreign policy aim of Volksdeutsch, the unification of German-speaking people under one Reich. In 1938, rioting broke out in the Sudetenland, and Hitler took this as a signal to step in and act as the hero, as he had done in Austria. Hitler ordered loyal Nazis in the Sudetenland to riot and protest against the Czech government. Then in May 1938, he brought troops to the border and made a public declaration of his intent to invade, posing as the rescuer of the persecuted Sudeten people. Hitler ordered loyal Nazis in the Sudetenland to riot and protest against the Czech government. Then in May 1938, he brought troops to the border and made a public declaration of his intent to invade, posing as the rescuer of the persecuted Sudeten people. Let's now examine Britain's response to the Sudeten crisis. Neville Chamberlain responded to Hitler's public declaration with trepidation. As part of the Paris Peace Conference, Britain had vowed to protect Czechoslovakia's independence against any aggression from Germany or other neighboring countries. On the 15th of September 1938, Chamberlain flew over to Germany and met Hitler in his mountain retreat in Bavaria. Hitler insisted that the only way to maintain peace was to allow Germany to take the Sudetenland. Desperate to maintain his anti-war policy of appeasement, Chamberlain then flew over to Czechoslovakia to negotiate on Hitler's behalf. Chamberlain placed considerable pressure on the Czech president to agree to Hitler's demand for the Sudetenland, and reluctantly, the Czech president agreed. Less than a week later, on the 22nd of September, Chamberlain returned to Germany with the good news. However, at this point Hitler changed his demands. He now wished for other border regions of Czechoslovakia to be given over to Poland and Hungary. This placed Chamberlain in a tricky position. This was not what he had agreed with the Czech president, and if Hitler was to invade the Sudetenland before everything had been fully agreed, then Britain was obliged to declare war. A week later, on the 29th of September, there was a much more formal meeting to settle the matter. This took place in Munich and so is known as the Munich Conference. It was not just between Britain and Germany this time, since representatives of Italy and France also attended. Notably, both Czechoslovakia and Russia were not invited to the conference. During the conference, Hitler made the same demands as those that he made to Chamberlain a week earlier. He wanted to take the Sudetenland for the Third Reich, but also give land to Hungary and Poland. He also demanded that the Czech army withdraw their troops from the Sudetenland. Both the French President Edward de Ladir and the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain were happy to agree to these demands. They believed that by meeting Hitler and making this a formal agreement, they had played their part in maintaining peace in Europe, and they had at least partially upheld Czechoslovakia's independence. However, they were essentially washing their hands of the problem, and they must have doubted Hitler's honesty when he promised to make no further territorial gains in Central Europe. 2 days after the Munich conference, on the 1st of October, Chamberlain met with Hitler separately again. Together they signed the Anglo-German Declaration that promised the two countries would not declare war against each other and uphold peace in Europe. This has been seen as the pinnacle of Britain's appeasement policy, since it was the third agreement that the British government had made with Hitler, following the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1953 and the Non-Aggression Pact of 1936. There was then an infamous moment in modern history. Neville Chamberlain arrived back to Britain overjoyed with his achievements. The press gathered around him on the airport runway, and he made a fateful speech called Peace in Our Time. As part of the speech, he held the Anglo-German Declaration in the air and announced on that very piece of paper there was proof that Hitler wanted nothing but peace in Europe. His speech was spoken to a jubilant crowd since the majority of the British public did not want to provoke Nazi Germany. But behind the scenes, others doubted the legitimacy of Chamberlain's piece of paper and the weight of Hitler's promises. Let's now focus on the consequence of the Munich Conference and Britain's policy of appeasement. Firstly, on the 10th of October 1938, less than a fortnight after the conference, Hitler invaded the Sudetenland without the official approval of the Czech government. However, by this point, they had already withdrawn their troops from the region, so there was little they could do about it. In a similar way to the Nazi invasion of Austria, the troops were greeted enthusiastically by members of the public. The Sudetens came out to line the street and throw flowers before the marching troops. However, the Munich conference had a negative impact on the Allies' relationship with Russia or the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin was very displeased that his nation had been excluded from the Munich conference. Hitler's invasion of the Sudetenland meant that the Third Reich was expanding ever closer towards the Soviet Union, and Hitler had made clear his hatred for communism. Stalin began to doubt whether France and Britain could protect Russia if Hitler was to continue to push eastwards. His pride was also wounded since the Allied powers were once again showing prejudice against the Soviet Union as a communist nation. This snub therefore became a contributing factor to the Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939, which was when Stalin chose to sign a non-aggression pact with Hitler in order to carve up Poland between the two nations. The Munich conference had been a missed opportunity for the Allied powers to make a stand against Hitler. Czechoslovakia had a strong army and so could have put up a decent defense against the Nazi regime, especially if they had the backing of France and Britain. This would have stopped Hitler from gaining even more land, resources, manpower, and most importantly, confidence. Instead, Hitler was now well positioned to continue his policy of Lebensraum. 6 months after the Munich Conference, in March 1939, Hitler launched a full invasion of Czechoslovakia, and thus breaking his side of the agreement. At this point, the British government decided to end their policy of appeasement and increase their own rearmament program, so to prepare for war. They also sent a diplomat, named Reginald Drax, to the Soviet Union to negotiate an alliance with Stalin. However, it was all too little too late, as by this point Hitler had set his sights on Poland. Hitler of course believed that the British would not try to stop the invasion. He assumed the policy of appeasement would continue, but this time he thought wrong. Let's return to the overarching question of why was Hitler able to conquer Czechoslovakia? Firstly, Hitler made a claim to the border region called the Sudetenland, where he claimed that German-speaking Sudetens were being persecuted. The Czech government agreed to this, but then Hitler went a step further and asked for more land to be taken and given to Hungary and Poland. This, the Czech government did not agree to, and this is what sparked the Munich Conference. The British government led negotiations with Hitler at the Munich Conference, but also in attendance were representatives from Italy and France. They agreed to let Hitler take the land he demanded without the consent of the Czech government. This is a strong example of appeasement, especially since Chamberlain and Hitler met the following day to reaffirm their alliance and intentions to avoid war. Hitler took the Sudetenland without the consent of the Czech government. Facing no negative consequences, he then went further and took the whole of Czechoslovakia 6 months later. Ultimately, this showed that Hitler could not keep to his promises and ended Britain's policy of appeasement. At this point, war was almost inevitable. Thank you for watching. Tune into the final lecture to learn about the final step in the war to road the Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939.